In 1877, Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, a scion of the Austrian branch of the Rothschild banking family, built a stately home called Waddesdo Manor in the countryside of Buckinghamshire. 20 years later, in the year before Rothschild's premature death, the Red Book, a commemorative photographic album dedicated to this house, its interiors, and collections, was produced in multiple copies. Examining the relationship between the self-fashioning of Ferdinand de Rothschild and the photographs of his own house and collections that he commissioned and compiled for this album offer insight into 19th century elite collecting practices in Europe, the Jewish experience, and the roles played by photographic representation in its articulation. The Red Book provides a visual tour of the forms and functions of Waddesdo Manor, producing a narrative account of the house as both a ritualistic and reflexive space. When mediated through the topographical framework of the album, photographic depictions of his property become self-conscious expressions of Ferdinand de Rothschild's own history, identity, and legacy. The Red Book is also the product of a wider material culture of country house albums executed by the Rothschild family, Jewish estate owners, and landed aristocracy in post-emancipation Europe. The photographic albums compiled at these properties feature the ornate collections of fine and decorative art objects integrated into grand houses built and renovated to display them. A fourth generation Rothschild, Baron Ferdinand built his country house around a collection he inherited from his family that he meticulously curated and added to, often invoking the royal collections of George IV and the Duc d'Aumale as inspiration. Yet he never lost sight of his own family's origins in the Frankfurt ghetto, writing, quote, "Moreover, it should be remembered that the country houses of Great Britain were hung with old masters and filled with old cabinets and china long before any member of my family ever dreamt of such luxuries." Nevertheless, it is the innovative collecting practices he attributed to his own family that he appears to be most impressed by. Quote, "For though it is true that they have been purchasing old works of art for nearly 3/4 of a century, it is the apparent ubiquitousness of my family, with its members residing in Vienna, Frankfurt, Paris, Naples, and London, and all of them lovers of and purchasers of old art, that accounts to a great extent for our name being so prominently identified with the accumulating of works of art of earlier periods." The Country House album is a product and document of these combined efforts and provides insights into the nuanced personal histories behind the creation of these famed collections. Born in Paris, raised in Germany and Austria, and domiciled in Britain, Ferdinand de Rothschild pointedly articulated his transnational identity at Waddesdo Manor. The French Renaissance chateau, surmounted by the black and yellow flag of the Austrian Empire in the heart of the English countryside, illustrates the dynamic nature of this Jewish country house and the manifold identities of its objects and occupants. The house and collections of Ferdinand de Rothschild are celebrated and well-known aspects of cultural heritage in Britain. His house, Waddesdo Manor, is a National Trust property, part of a wider network of culturally significant sites across the country. And his objet d'art collection, known as the Waddesdo Bequest, has a dedicated wing in the British Museum. Although Ferdinand and the unmistakable European features of his house and collections have been analyzed in various visual and social contexts, his photographic collections and his Jewish identity are notably absent from previous scholarship. This oversight is often attributed to the destruction of his personal papers upon his death. Yet utilizing a small collection of publications by Ferdinand on his collecting practice can serve as an ekphrastic accompaniment to the modern inventories of his collections compiled by scholars and curators. To further enrich our present understanding of his complex ipsity, I will focus on the significance of his previously overlooked photo album. More than the sum of the parts, I will use the Red Book to construct a topo analysis of Ferdinand's vision of his property and collections as suggestive of what he valued most in his home and the ideals he desired to express about himself. The advent of photographic practice in rural setting in the 1840s coincides with the acquisition of country estates by an emergent Jewish aristocracy, as related to the wider campaign for Jewish emancipation across Europe. This period witnessed the first generation of builders and image makers that used photography to visualize houses. The rich archive of country house images reveals that photographs of visual programs at country estates were central to promulgating the changing individual and cultural realities and mythologies associated with architectural heritage sites. The photographic album provides a record, document, and diary of this effort. Situating the grand houses and collections into a more vernacular framework, the commemorative album holds both the narratives of social histories and subjective experiences present in the spaces and objects it depicts. Made popular in the second half of the 19th century, the Commemorative Country House album is an overlooked piece of material culture found in many country house collections and archives. Images from the albums are often reproduced and used to illustrate histories associated with a particular location or object, but have not been examined as a discrete genre before. They're a hybrid product that incorporates more defined photographic album genres, like the historic monument survey, art illustration, and family albums. Contemporary albums of houses across Britain and Europe produced by Ferdinand's family and social circle are strikingly similar in content and appearance. They often assume a seemingly prescribed format. Arranged into intricate leather bindings, a collection of albumen or salt photographic prints tour the viewer through the house, beginning with exterior views, moving to interior views, and finishing with images of featured objects and displays from the house collections. The Red Book does all of these things, but reading it closely, there are additional features that enrich this object, making it a unique expression of Ferdinand de Rothschild's vision of himself that even suggests a symbolic slippage between man and house. The album positions the house and its collections as a comprehensive of that must be experienced together, where both objects and space are contingent upon one another. Ferdinand de Rothschild furnishes the album with an introductory essay that begins with information on the construction of Waddesdo Manor, followed by 27 images summarized as follows. Quote, "The photographs represent the northern and southern aspects of the exterior of the house, the sitting rooms taken from different points of view, and some of the pictures, furniture, and ornaments." Ferdinand promises in this short foreword to provide his reader with aspects of his property. When defined, aspect can assume a multiplicity of schematic values that alert us to the potential complexities this object affords in our interpretation of what it promises and produces. The material circumstances of its creation are notably absent. There is no photographer or publisher credited, and we don't know how many were printed. What were previously assumed to be photographic prints used to depict his rich historical house materials are in fact quite exceptionally photomechanical reproductions, a very innovative technological application for this period. Yet the interface of technology and historical materials is very central to the animus of Waddesdo Manor. Amidst the meticulously curated historical facades and fixtures, his house rests on technological progress, as it was supported by durable steel framing and accessible through newly laid train lines. Ferdinand wrote, quote, "The fact remains that my family first revived the decoration of 18th century in its purity, reconstructing the rooms out of old material, reproducing them as they had been during the reign of the Louis, while at the same time adapting them to modern requirement." And here are some views of the book. Born in 1839, Ferdinand de Rothschild was the sixth child and second son of Anselm von Rothschild, head of the Vienna branch of the family bank in 1855, and his mother Charlotte, the eldest child of Nathan, founder of the English Rothschild Bank. Raised in Vienna, Ferdinand spent autumns in Schillersdorf, a schloss along the confluence of the Oder and Osla rivers, summers at Grüneberg, a Franco-German Renaissance-style house his father built outside of Frankfurt, as well as long visits to England at his maternal grandparents' country house, Gunnerbury Park, as well as he was also well acquainted with Chateau Ferrières that belonged to his uncle James's France, just to mention a few of the great houses he frequented. As the first generation of Rothschilds to immersively experience this transnational country house culture, the international network of Rothschild country houses and decorative styles known today as Le Goût Rothschild was very much ingrained in him and part of his reality. Ferdinand moved to London from Vienna after his mother's death in 1859. There he married his cousin Milena in 1865, but she tragically died in childbirth only 1 year later, leaving him a childless widower. He would never remarry. Ferdinand remained loosely engaged in his family business in Vienna, but found greater contentment cultivating his interest in the antiques market, often brokering deals and hunting for objects for his relations with more liquid assets. By then, he had also had an eye on acquiring a country house. A letter to his father in 1872 requests funds to purchase an estate in Northamptonshire. At this time, a number of his Rothschild cousins had begun to acquire properties in the Aylesbury Vale after the bankruptcy of the Duke of Buckingham and Sir John Dashwood brought wide tracts of land in this area to the market. His father, Anselm, flatly denied his request and suggested if Ferdinand was desirous of land ownership, it was more prudent to acquire acreage in Germany that yielded 4.5% return rather than the 3% from British soil. This did not persuade him to abandon England, however, and in 1874, his fortunes changed as his father died, leaving Ferdinand free to fulfill his desire for a country house of his own, along with half of his father's exquisite collections of medieval and Renaissance metalwork and objets d'art that would form the basis of Ferdinand's own collection. The other half of the collection went to his brother Nathaniel, who remained in Vienna. Waddesdo was a monumental project that involved the plateauing of Lodge Hill. The house took nearly 10 years to complete. The resulting imposing manor house, designed in the French Renaissance style by Hippolyte Destailleur, had 45 rooms, all dressed in imported 18th century French interiors, complete with gardens designed by French landscape architect Élie Launay, with subsequent dairies, stables, greenhouses, aviaries, and an additional house extension over the years. Ferdinand's Buckinghamshire estate was where he gained political power, becoming the local Liberal Unionist member of Parliament, where he housed his great collections of furnishings and art objects, and a social hub where he played the distinguished host to the cultural, economic, and political elites of Britain and Europe, as well as his wider family network. Just 1 year before his heart attack on his 59th birthday, Ferdinand published the Red Book, celebrating, documenting, and memorializing the space and the objects he surrounded himself with. While the album suggests a temporal and spatial narrative depicting through text and images the transformation of the site from raised land to finished house interiors, the linear chronology of these events is distorted when we consider the mnemonic structures of the album. The Red Book opens with Ferdinand's foreword that plots the arc of Waddesdo's creation from nothingness and concludes with his prediction that the house will fall to ruin, portending his own death. The following photographic tour through the house begins with exterior views and concludes with images of his display cases of objets d'art. Yet these items that the album ends on are in fact the oldest objects in his collection. The display cabinet of 16th century metalwork, enamel, and rock crystal that he inherited from his father, though not the most expensive items in the house, their placement as the final images of the book affirms their value. What occurs at the conclusion of the album is in fact the beginning of Ferdinand's collecting, and what sparked the creation of the house as a repository for these items. Thus subverting a temporal logic, the layout of the Red Book is somewhat circular. It is unclear if the book ends on pieces that relate to his past, present, or future. The temporal, spatial, and hermeneutic aspects unique to the photographic album can be applied to interpret how Ferdinand used the Red Book to situate his legacy through the photographic display of his house and possessions. This is not the first time these 16th century German and Renaissance collections had been represented or singled out as important family objects. I have located two other renderings of them. First, they appear in a painting by Ferdinand's mother, Charlotte, seen to the right. This 1838 self-portrait of her husband and young family show them within an almost modest domestic interior, but her husband Anselm's display case is clearly visible at the right side of the image. It grounds the painting. Unlike the more traditional portraiture device, which often depicts windows onto views of the sitter's dominion, the window view on the left-hand side is obscured by a green cloth. This small detail renders their interior scene placeless, with the cabinet absorbing the viewer's background attention. This obstructed view could be understood as allegorical for the Rothschild family, as they did not necessarily qualify their interpretation of a dynastic tradition by land, especially at this time when they were barred from even owning land in Austria, but instead transfer it through these portable and inherited objects. The objects from this case are again reproduced in 1864, this time in photographs from Anselm's collection catalog. The 2-volume tome covers 452 individual items and contains photographs of 27 key pieces, seen here. The bulk of his collections were divided between Ferdinand and his brother Nathaniel, who remained in Austria, but it should be noted he was an equally avid collector, connoisseur, and house builder. Anselm hired writer, curator, and art historian Franz Scheistag to compile his catalog. Scheistag worked for the Imperial Royal Austrian Museum of Art and Industry, which notably also contains several objects from collections linked to Rudolf II. This is important, and Anselm's catalog follows closely on the heels of the first fully photographically illustrated auction catalog. This was produced in an 1860 Christie's sale in London of items from the collections of Rudolf II, put forward by the Frankfurt-based art dealers, the Loewenstein brothers. The publication was entitled Catalogue of the Celebrated Collection of Works of Art and Virtue, known as the Vienna Museum. The catalog features 36 salt prints and 4 chromolithographs produced by Hermann Emden, a prominent German Jewish photographer who's more well known for producing one of the earliest photographically illustrated albums of historic sites in Germany. Yet 4 years after the Illustrated Christie's catalog, salt prints were effectively out of use. And for Anselm's catalog, he had albumin prints made by a Viennese photographer of Hungarian origin named Victor Angerer. Angerer is an important figure in early photography, as he was the executive committee director of the Photographic Society of London, and his work was featured in exhibitions in Berlin, Paris, and London. Later in his career, he was also a member of the Vienna Camera Club, an organization endowed by Nathaniel von Rothschild. As Angerer's involvement in the Camera Club suggests, his photographic legacy rested on his innovation in and mastery of photomechanical processes. The enthusiasm for these specialist printing techniques was shared by Nathaniel von Rothschild, who was himself an accomplished photographer. He even had a dark room on his yacht. Nathaniel produced at least 3 illustrated albums of fine collotypes, seen here and here. The pioneering use of high-quality photomechanical techniques by Nathaniel can perhaps offer an explanation for the unusual application of this method in the Red Book, something that I have not yet seen used by any of Ferdinand's English or French families' commemorative albums produced before 1900. This technique was certainly more expensive to produce than regular photographic prints, but it made for lasting and unfading results. For this reason, it was also adopted as the preferred choice of printing for art reproduction albums at this period. The key is the durability of this technique, does not fade or deteriorate, and has a fine and even finish, which returns to the very basic function of the Red Book as an object of memorialization and preservation in relation to Ferdinand's own anxieties about the future. The album packages Waddesdo Manor as an oeuvre while disassociating it from its physical location. The act of recording the house and its collections for perpetuity can also be related to the Waddesdo bequest, his donation to the British Museum, where he served as a trustee. Perhaps illustrative of Ferdinand's outlook on land and patrimony, the contents of the collection of the new smoking room remained intact, but were readily disjoined from their original location at Waddesdo Manor. However, this process was first enacted through the compilation of the Red Book. Ferdinand's speculation that his estate would go to, quote, weeds after his passing reflects his perception that his house was impermanent. Marrying the translation of the house into an album format, Ferdinand bequeathed his personal collection to a public institution shows that he did not view it as necessarily fixed to his property. As someone without an heir, he repeatedly expressed deep anxiety about the breaking up of his collection. His commemorative album steers away from a catalog format of individual identification of his precious objets d'art and instead focuses on the objects in situ. The importance of display cases rather than individual objects suggests the continuity of the collection is of utmost concern. Ferdinand repeatedly wrote about the fate of French collections after the Revolution and bemoans the dispersal of great European collections in events like the Loewenstein cell, stressing the importance of the act of collecting and curating almost above the objects themselves. His fears were fueled by more than just his historical interest. He too experienced firsthand the occupation of his father's country house in Silesia, as well as his uncle's house Verrières during the Franco-Prussian War. While the family retained the properties after the conflict, for the period it became evident how tenuous their claim to property was on the continent. This perhaps suggests yet another appeal of his adopted homeland. In England, since the 18th century, the country house was regarded as a bastion of civility and patrician authority. Public consumption of various guides and publications about country houses worked to implicitly celebrate the social supremacy of the landed interest. These resources familiarized the materiality of landowners' wealth through a political system which valued property and stability, while simultaneously promoting a sense of shared culture. The decision to privilege public access to his private domain was both social and politically motivated. Ferdinand goes into great depth on this topic in the 1875 article he published in the Fortnightly Review entitled Expanding Art, where he lists several continental examples he wished to emulate. The rise of public art institutions appealed to his philanthropic desire to educate and elevate his community, but it also could be interpreted as a solution to the historical problem of displacement. The importance of keeping the objects together superseded the matter of their final location, reflecting the conceptualization of the collection and his album that documented it as a form of cultural memory. He perhaps did exercise some foresight in this decision, as in 1999, Nearly 100 years after the Waddesdo bequest was firmly housed in the British Museum, less than 800 meters away at Christie's London, the collections of his brothers Nathaniel and Albert that had been recovered from Nazi seizure in Vienna were auctioned off and entirely dispersed in a spectacular landmark sale. Furthermore, this dynamic of his prized collections and house preserved by the Red Book extends forward beyond the 19th century, as the organization of both Waddesdo Manor and the Waddesdo bequest at present are reproductions based on photographs from the Red Book. Seeming to define Ferdinand's prediction that the house would fall into decay, it is in fact at present preserved by the limits the album dictated a century after its creation. The trace of memory and vision that shapes our encounter with Waddesdo Manor today affirms the relevance of the Commemorative Country House album. A close reading of the Red Book offers a new approach to the historical framing of Ferdinand de Rothschild and his legacy at Waddesdo Manor. The complex network of intersecting relationships and synchronous histories of houses, collections, Jewish patrons, and photography can be read as contingent and interwoven systems of signification when deciphered through the album format. Identifying how the social and interior self is condensed into narrative structures of objects like the Red Book provides insight into both Jewish experience and photography at country houses, opening the understudy genre of commemorative country house photographic albums to the possibilities of wider critical appreciation. Thank you.
Art and art collecting in Warsaw, as well as in Poland between the 19th and 20th century, had a special meaning due to the country's geopolitical situation, which we already have mentioned today and I think yesterday. Poland, or to be more precise, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, lost its independence at the end of the 18th century and disappeared from the map of Europe for more than 100 years until regaining its independence in 1918. This had an immense impact on the national culture. Lost sovereign created a particular kind of romantic and later post-romantic paradigm present in the literature and visual arts. The main purpose of culture was to maintain the national identity in time of Poland's partition conducted by the Russian Imperium, the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Austrian Habsburg monarchy. Thus, art critics postulated the necessity of painting historical works commemorating glorious Polish victories from the past or contrary, tragically failed heroic uprisings. Also, seeming mundane representations of landscape or folklore were often more than just a random depiction of the nearby countryside, becoming a parabola for the idealized beauty of the homeland's nature. Therefore, art in Poland gained a special status, becoming a part of the national endemic culture using the symbolism of a very distinct post-romantic imaginarium. In 1860, the Society for the Encouragement of Fine Arts in Warsaw was established to bring together artists and art patrons and therefore to influence the creation of the national art scene. On the one side, the society supported the development of Polish visual arts. On the other, it led to its Semitization and detachment from the mainstream of development, the unquestionable center of which was Paris. As a result, Polish art maintained its academic character while neglecting the formal artistic explorations initiated in West Europe by Impressionism and its followers. Although the situation changed somewhat at the beginning of the 20th century and galleries supporting more avant-garde artistic groups were emerging, the conservative direction of Polish art dominated Warsaw art market and art collecting scene in Poland at least until 1939. Many collectors in Warsaw came from now largely forgotten groups, the bourgeoisie and intelligentsia of Jewish descent. In one of the first essays on Warsaw art collecting based on the reports of the mentioned Society for the Encouragement of Fine Arts, Joanna Hensel stated, quote, in the second half of the 19th century, paintings were bought primarily by the Persons, the Blochs, the Epsteins, the Fayances, the Flatows, the Goldbergs, the Goldfeders, the Goldsteins, the Grossmans, the Cronenbergs, and many other members of completely assimilated families who also rendered a great service to Polish culture and science, end of quote. Archival sources, mainly in the National Museum in Warsaw, confirmed those findings. Not only wealthy members of industrialists or bankers' families were collecting, also people from the world of culture, science, especially doctors and lawyers. In most cases, they were utterly distancing themselves from the Judaic tradition of their fathers and grandfathers. In my already accomplished research, I concentrated on 4 study cases: Edward Reicher, Leon Franciszek Goldberg-Górski, Gustav Wertheim, and Bronisław Krystal. Each of these collectors created an outstanding representative selection of Polish art of the period. Edward Reicher, which we can see here, the oldest one, was a merchant. He owned around 400 paintings, among others by Józef Chełmoński, Aleksander Gierymski, Jacek Malczewski, Julian Fałat, Stanisław Wyspiański, so the first names of Polish art of that time. He also had 3 albums with sketches by Jan Matejko. Let's move to Jan Matejko here. A painter perceived as the most important national artist of the second half of the 19th century. It was impossible to create a significant collection of Polish art without Matejko's works. The primary source concerning Edward Reicher's collection is a catalogue written by the collector himself, published in 1918. The publishing year is notable. In 1918, Reicher relocated from Aleksandrów Kujawski to Warsaw, the country's capital city that had just regained its independence. At the same time, he symbolically presented his collection to the world with the catalogue, a copy of which he also donated to the National Museum in Warsaw. The catalogue was accompanied by an introduction in which Reicher presented himself as in an exalted way as a defender of the national cultural heritage during the First World War. It was a manifesto, unambiguously defining the social and patriotic nature of his collecting. However, the collection contained also works of painters of Jewish origin, like Maurycy Trębacz, Maurycy and Leopold Gottlieb, Samuel Hirschenberg, Stanisław Heyman, Szymon Buchbinder, Henryk Hochman. Mainly works by Maurycy Gottlieb, Jan Matejko's student, were regarded as an ideological bridge, a bridge between Judaism and Christianity, a symbol of reconciliation between Poles and Jews. Therefore, it is striking that the catalogue does not contain any reproduction of works referring to, so to speak, Jewishness. An exception was the self-portrait of Maurycy Gottlieb, which we can see here, even though the self-portrait itself did not present anything from the Jewish theme. For comparison, Gottlieb's most famous image was his self-portrait as an ancient king Ahasverus, symbolizing the tragic figure of the wandering Jew. A special expression of complex Jewish identity was Gottlieb's self-portrait as a Polish nobleman, now owned by the Jewish Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. One of the paintings belonging to the non-reproduced Jewish part of the catalogue was Samuel Hirschenberg's The Black Banner, now owned by the Jewish Museum in New York. This poignant work, painted in 1905 as a reaction to the news about pogroms in Russia, was classified by Professor Richard Cohen as one of the icons of Jewish painting, presenting the nation's tragic fate. After the collector died in 1927, the collection was inherited by his family. Summing up, Edward Reicher's collection could be understood as a deliberate construct of a new form of Polish Jewish, so to speak, national collection containing Polish, Jewish, and Polish Jewish artists, so representing this inclusiveness. One of Warsaw's best collections, which I want to briefly mention, was belonging to Leon Franciszek Goldberg-Górski, who was a military dentist. He studied in Berlin, Wrocław, and Kharków. In 1915, at the mature age of 51, he joined the Polish army as a volunteer and a sought-after maxillofacial surgery specialist. In 1918, he decided to convert and received a Catholic baptism in order to get a job in the military hospital in Warsaw. Goldberg-Górski purchased art mainly through the Society for the Encouragement of Fine Arts and during his visits to artists' ateliers. He stayed in contact with Jacek Malczewski and Józef Chełmoński, which may explain the large number of these artists' works in his collection. Although Chełmoński's Cross in the Snowstorm is a realistic representation, it fits into one of the important themes of Polish art, depicting cemeteries as a metaphor of national martyrology, a symbol of the victims in fights for the country's independence during national uprisings. Goldberg-Górski also owned works by Matejko, Brandt, Wierusz Kowalski, Maksymilian and Aleksander Gierymski, Wyczółkowski, Wyspiański, Olga Boznańska, as well as several paintings by the so-called Polish Impressionists Podkowinski and Pankiewicz. A significant aspect of this collection was the large number of paintings with religious content, which in the context of Goldberg-Górski's conversion could have been an act of emphasizing or taming a new element of his identity. Goldberg-Górski died in 1937. Following his will, the entire collection was donated to the National Museum in Warsaw. And now I will just briefly mention other collection. Gustav Vertin, who studied economics in Leipzig. And I'm mentioning those places where they studied deliberately because they have all studied in German-speaking universities. In Warsaw, he became a deputy director of a state-owned munitions company. His magnificent modernist villa in Konstancin near Warsaw was the elite's meeting place, visited among others by famous piano player Artur Rubinstein. The villa also contained an exquisite collection highlighting the family's high social standing and long-lasting acculturation. Vertin, in 1939, during German Nazi occupation of Warsaw, committed a suicide. And the whole part of the collection was then given and stayed in the National Museum in Warsaw. Part of this collection is still in family, among the family members. And last but not least is Bronisław Krystal, who was an art historian, son of a merchant who studied aesthetics in German Marburg and who completed his PhD in Bern in Switzerland. His collection was distinguished by more modern art, although modern also of a national character. He collected paintings and sculptures of artists who represented Polish art internationally. He, for example, at International Exhibition in Paris in 1925. What is more, he also collected Judaica. Here are some paintings. Sorry for the speedy presentation. Bronisław Krystal survived war. He escaped, he managed to escape from the Warsaw Ghetto. He died in 1983 at the age of almost 100 years. He donated his entire collection and even his real estate to the National Museum in Warsaw again. This is one of his last pictures. 4 case studies briefly discussed in this paper constitute a particular section of the Warsaw collecting scene of the time. Reicher, Goldberg-Górski, Wertheim, and Krystal represented a varying degree of assimilation, which was reflected in the created collections. Belonging to the Jewish origin minority, which Anna Landau-Czajka referred to as the third nation, they were suspended between 2 cultures, not being part of the Jewish community, but simultaneously not admitted to Polishness. And at this point, it is important to remind what Helena Dattner stated, quote, Jewish intelligentsia assimilated to Polishness in the sense of a strong national feeling. However, the national discourse in the mid-19th century was defined by the categories of community of land, history, common values, and ideals. Differently than at the end of the 19th century and then later on at the beginning of the 20th century, when ethnic racial rhetoric began to dominate, end of quote. To conclude, Pierre Cabin wrote in his classic study on collecting that, I quote, every collection is a public confession, a showing of the cards, including false cards, of men who is not, cannot be like others, end of quote. Cabin and others like Baudrillard, Mieke Ball, and Susan Pierce, they all are defining collecting as one of the best compensatory activities. It creates an opportunity for escapism, for creating one's own safe microcosm, which separates him or her from the frightening reality. At the same time, it becomes a phantom extension of one's own self, facilitating functioning in the social world. Thus, collections were not only the end result of the identity building process, they were part of it, helping to create and manifest this new identity. Being an element of the collector's extended self, as Russell Burke named it, the collection is simultaneously his autobiographical object. And so it all was also for Reicher, Goldberg-Gurski, Wertheim, Krystal, and many other collectors, not only in Warsaw before 1939. Thank you for the attention.
In this presentation, I will explore the expression of Jewish ethnographic scholarship as it was manifested in the collecting and studying of Jewish ritual objects. The 3 case studies selected for this talk of Jewish men who were immersed in societies of Paris, London, as well as the United States demonstrate how secular Jewish members of society found ways to remain attached to Judaism. Their famed collections of Jewish ritual objects were exhibited in major international exhibitions, such as the 1878 Universal Exposition in Paris and the Anglo-Jewish Historical Exhibition that opened in London in April 1887. Later, objects originating in these collections formed the basis of Jewish ritual object collections in important institutions, such as the Cluny Museum. Nowadays, these objects are, of course, part of the Museum of Jewish Art and History in Paris, and the Jewish Museum in New York. The interest in collecting Jewish ritual objects and interpreting them as works of art did not take place overnight, of course. Rather, it was a result of key political and social changes taking place in Europe. And just to name a few, we have the Escalam Movement, which was the Jewish Enlightenment, inspired, of course, by European Enlightenment, and developed at the end of the 18th century. It offered an incorporation of Jewish culture and cultural and secular education with traditional Talmudic studies, and by so doing, modernizing Judaism, promoting Jewish scholarship and literature while incorporating Jews in modern Western secular life. Identified with the Escalam movement, as you see here to our right, is Moses Mendelssohn, German Jewish philosopher and scholar, who published the first 5 books of the Old Testament in Hebrew characters. The second political movement is Jewish emancipation, which was already mentioned. And it basically meant granting Jewish equal citizenship rights, which was expressed in the efforts of Jews to integrate into local societies. France, I just brought a small example here, but France was the first to grant Jews rights in 1789, followed by different sections of what is today Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, United Kingdoms, and throughout many parts of Europe until early 20th century. Other social processes that are intertwined with the Escala and the emancipation movements include the urbanization, the immigration from distant villages and isolated residential areas into cities, the industrialization, and as I mentioned, secularization and the Jewish effort to better their social and economic opportunities and to become integrated with local society. Of course, this was not enough. In 19th century, a move towards academic study of Judaism in Germany, the Wissenschaft des Judentums, the science of Judaism, developed, which was an academic study of Judaism. And it was considered one of the outcomes of the Escala movement. It introduced a modern critical and historical form of Jewish studies created by applying different methods of textual study, which before that was used to interpret Greek and Latin texts primarily, and to study Christianity. But now it was used for Jewish texts and for Judaism. And finally, as you can see in the images here, ethnographic interests and anthropological research of minority groups that developed during late 18th century and early 19th century. Imperialism served as an opportunity for members of civilized societies to observe a variety of populations while questioning religious groups and other minorities and shaping what later became cultural anthropology. Russian and Yiddish writer, who I brought as an example here, S. Ansky, whose full name was Shloime Zainpil Rappaport, led ethnographic expeditions between 1912 and 1914 to study Jewish ethnography and folklore at the Pale of Settlements, territories of the Russian Empire, in which Jews were allowed to settle, which is today around the area of Belarus. He saw this as a national timely mission to record oral relics, whether it was songs, traditions, legends, that before they become extinct due to the process already taking place of the urbanization and secularization of Jewish population. And as part of the future education of Jewish children and youth. He was also interested in material culture, and during his visits, he documented synagogues, Jewish ritual objects, Jewish documents and communal documents, marriage contracts, cemeteries, and gravestones. And eventually his collection included over 800 items and over 2,000 photographs from approximately 70 Jewish communities. These were all displayed in the St. Petersburg Jewish Museum in 1917 and then in 1923. Another background to perhaps this presentation is the idea of the rise of anti-Semitism during 19th century and early 20th century. And here I'm just bringing an example of France to be brief. It's important to keep in mind that in parallel to these social changes, and perhaps despite certain efforts of the Jewish upper class, this period was saturated with growing anti-Semitism, leading up to the Dreyfus Affair of 1894, which was when a French Jewish military captain, you can see him here to your right, was falsely accused of treason and sentenced for life in prison. He was later released, and his trial was basically canceled. The Anti-Semite League of France was also founded by the French writer and journalist Edouard Tourmont in 1889, and you can see his publication, La Libre Parole, here to your left. And also, of course, the fabricated text of the so-called Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which described a made-up Jewish conspiracy to take control over the world. So these are all issues that were part of the development of anti-Semitism at the turn of the century. Reviewing these processes taking place at the time serves as a concrete basis to understanding the development of Jewish ritual object collections and the three case studies I'm going to focus on. The first one is the case of Isaac Strauss. In her book about the history of Jewish museums, Natalia Bergel describes Strauss's collection as the first Judaica collection presented as a collection of Jewish art. Strauss was born in Strasbourg in 1806 and joined his brother in Paris at the age of 21. There he played the violin and composed dance music. At the time, the French king Louis Philippe entrusted him with organizing balls for the court, and later he was also appointed the director of the Royal Orchestra. Strauss was an avid art collector. His collection, presented at his Vichy home, was composed of 18th century paintings and decorative art, as well as Jewish ritual objects. He collected these items throughout his travels in Europe and primarily in Germany. Collecting material culture was not something that only Strauss did. It was actually a fashionable endeavor at the time. And although Strauss was part of a larger group of Jewish ritual object collectors, he is still considered to this day one, if not the first example of a collection of exquisite Jewish ritual object that was not only put together for the purpose of aesthetic collecting, but it was also the first one to be publicly displayed. Strauss's collection was displayed in a prestigious Palais de Trocadero in Paris, in part, which was part of the collection, only 82 items, in 1878 at the Universal Exhibition. that lasted for 6 months. The exhibition celebrated the Third French Republic and marked France's recovery from the Franco-Prussian War that ended in the spring of 1871. The exhibitions showcased innovations in electricity alongside new machines such as Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, Hughes's microphone, and Edison's phonograph. Visitors could take a hot air balloon tour over Paris, and by the time of its closing, we're talking about over 16 million paid visits to the exhibition. So a lot of people were able to visit Strauss's, a large portion of Strauss's collection. The Trocadero Palace, where Strauss's collection was displayed, was divided into 2 large wings connected by a central rotunda where musical performances were held. An exhibition of ethnography and French monuments was held in one of the wings alongside Strauss's collection. And the preface to Strauss's exhibition catalog describes his collection as one of its kind, displaying examples of uniquely rich Jewish craftsmanship of communal and private use, and objects that are equal in their beauty to Christian ritual objects. It describes Strauss's collecting as a form of conscientious preservation and a form of research of great interest. The preface also continues to describe a selection of objects exhibited, explaining their usage during the Jewish holidays and festivals, while implying on their European origins. These include, just to name a few and show you the examples here that are taken from the catalog, a Torah ark and the Teiva. You can see the Teiva here to your right, which is the place where the cantor recites and sings the prayer in the synagogue. Lamps for celebration of Hanukkah, Havdalah spice boxes, which you can see here to your right. Also, marriage contracts, an example here is here on your left, and Torah shields and Torah pointers on your right. Strauss later, 9 years later to be exact, put his collection on display at the Anglo-Jewish Historical Exhibition in London once again. The exhibition aimed to promote knowledge of Anglo-Jewish history, to create a deeper interest in its records and relics, and to aid their preservation, while also determining the extent of materials which exist for the compilation of a history of Jews in England. Artifacts illuminating the history together with religious art and miscellaneous antiquities were placed in public display, and a series of lectures was also given during the exhibition. Alongside antiquarian remains illustrating the history of Jews in England, 2 key collections of objects of ritual arts and other Jewish antiquities were displayed, and I marked them here on the map on your right. The Strauss collection, of course, on the bottom, and the Reuben David Sassoon collection at the right at the edge, which I will touch on momentarily. The exhibit included Hebrew deeds relating to transactions of early English Jews, portraits of Anglo-Jewish men, ancient Jewish coins, and a collection of exhibits from the Bnei Israel community of India. The exhibition prompted a renewed sense of interest in the history of Jews of England, as well as a taste of beautiful objects of Jewish ritual art. In a similar effort to equate Jews as artistically developed and knowledgeable as Christian members of civilized Western society expressed in the Strauss exhibition catalog 9 years earlier, by stressing the way the Jews were members of a long history in English society, the Anglo-Jewish exhibition was staking claim for Jews to be rightfully recognized as loyal British subjects. Strauss passed away in 1888, and in 1890, a sale of his collection was held in Paris. At his death, Charlotte de Rothschild purchased 149 items of Jewish ritual objects, which she donated to the French nation. The objects were deposited at the Musée Cluny in 1890, and you can see them in a selection of them in the postcard here to your right. And the room in which they were exhibited was named after her late husband, Nathaniel de Rothschild. Charlotte held back a few objects, while her son kept a few others. Today, the objects are located at as I mentioned, at the Museum of Jewish Art and History in Paris. So as I briefly mentioned, my second case study is Reuben David Sassoon, who was born to a family originating in Baghdad. Reuben was the 4th son, born in 1834 after the family migrated to India, and began collecting Jewish ritual objects avidly only after moving to live in London in 1867 at the age of 33. Similarly to Strauss, upon transitioning to live in London, Sassoon, who also joined his brother in the city, and similar again to Strauss, managed to quickly climb the social ladder. He became a member of the social clique of fashionable men, so-called the Marlborough House or the Smart Set, which evolved around Edward, Prince of Wales. Upon his coronation, Reuben and his brother were appointed members of the Royal Victorian Order. The basis for Sassoon's famed collection was actually purchased in 1867 at the Philip Solomon's collection sale. A few words about Solomon's collection. He was considered one of the first serious buyers of antique Judaica, buying not just contemporary English items for use, but choosing to acquire modern and historic European samples as well. His collection was displayed in his rooftop synagogue in London, where it was admired by his contemporaries. Sassoon continued growing that collection upon purchasing it, with important examples of Jewish art from England, Germany, Galicia, and Italy, which he also kept in his private synagogue at his home. And I can give you the address, but I don't think we need it this evening. After Sassoon's, and just to show you a few examples. We'll get to the examples. I switched the slides, sorry. After Sassoon's passing in 1905, his great niece and sister-in-law, Flora Gaby Sassoon, inherited the collection. The following year, in 1906, many of the items were lent to the Whitechapel Art Gallery exhibitions of Jewish art titled Jewish Art and Antiquities, where they were publicly displayed for the very last time. The Whitechapel exhibition and Whitechapel Gallery was located in the heart of the Jewish East End community. The exhibition was organized in support of the local Jewish societies and originally planned in 1905 to mark the revision of the Aliens Bill passed in response to persecuted Jews of Eastern Europe and their migration to the West. It was open for 6 weeks and visited by over 150,000 people. It followed the same key ideas as the 1887 Anglo-Jewish exhibition, to gather together rare and costly and beautiful apprentices from the synagogues in London, in addition to share to them many beautiful exhibits associated with domestic devotion from private owners, to show rare manuscripts and books for the delectation of all, especially for scholars and bibliologists, to illustrate by selection of portraits and prints the history of Jews in England since the Protectorate of Cornwall, which was 1653, to exhibit examples of works by mainly English artists, and also to include pictures of some foreigners, notably Dutch illustrations by Joseph Israels. The catalog also stressed the notion of Jews having their own distinct history in England, and Jewish involvement in European culture was praised. The image of the Jew described in the exhibition catalog expresses an intellectual, artistic, emotional, socially mobile person who is also capable of being assimilated. And here are a few examples from the collection. In the past 2 decades, items from the Sassoon collection have been put on auction, culminating in last year's December 2020's auction at Sotheby's, New York, which came up with a very lavish and beautiful catalog which accompanied it. And here are examples from that catalog. And our last example, since I don't want to take too much of our time, and I chose this example just to show that this was a phenomena that went beyond Europe as we know it. So this is really the case study of Haide Ephraim Ben Giyad, who was a Turkish Jewish antique dealer from the port city of Izmir. His collection was expanded by traveling across Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. He collected decorative art, paintings, tapestries, Jewish ritual objects, and the list is very extensive. And if I have time, I'll get into it. He also used to celebrate some of the items that he actually collected to actively celebrate Jewish holidays, since he lived in a traditional lifestyle. In late 19th century, he expanded his business to the United States, establishing shops in Boston, New York, and San Francisco, where he eventually settled at the end of the century. The collection was brought to the United States to be displayed in 2 world fairs. First, in Chicago in 1893, at the World Columbian Exposition, which celebrated the 400th year to Columbus's voyage to the continent. And later in 1904 in St. Louis, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, where Benguiat lavishly displayed his collection at the Damascus Palace. And here you have the Damascus Palace, the exterior image of it, of course, to your left, and the right image shows you a very small part of the interior. There's actually a wonderful catalog that is available online if you want to see more images from that exhibition, which is spectacular. As part of the foreign pavilions, this was, of course, exhibited in 1904 alongside Germany, Morocco, samples of places, of holy places from Jerusalem, Japan, and the Philippines, just to name a few of the countries that were involved. This exhibition actually noted in the catalog a list of the different types of objects he had in his collections. And the list, as I mentioned, is very extensive, and I'm happy to send it later to anybody who's interested. Following the 1904 display, Cyrus Adler, curator and librarian at the Smithsonian Institution, published a catalog of the Benguiat collection. At the time, the Jewish ritual object collection was on loan at the Smithsonian Institution. It actually remained there until even past Benguiat's death in 1918. Adler later, in 1924, became the president of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and there, since he remained interested in the collection, he managed to purchase the entire collection for the Jewish Museum in New York, which is where it's held today. In parallel to the process of secularization, urbanization, and industrialization, as it was experienced by many European Jews in the 19th century, material objects representing tradition and a former way of life became collectibles. While Jewish communities, texts, and folklore were being researched academically, a discovery of Jewish art and artisanship developed as part of a social effort to present Jews as contributing members of civilized societies. Although I've only briefly been able to show, this was a time of a rise of anti-Semitism, but despite that, starting with Strauss, Jews chose to publicly and sometimes openly display Jewish ritual objects and communal records for the first time, inviting non-Jews and Jews alike to study and learn about them, something that until now was mostly done privately and as part of a Jewish tradition. The historian Richard Cohen called this situation self-exposure, which I think is really to the point. By exhibiting and studying Jewish ritual objects, these collections and collectors were using ritual art to shape a secular Jewish identity as part of a broader historical context of their time. For these and other collectors of Jewish ritual objects of the period, such artifacts were understood as ethnographic and artistic tools interpreted through a secular and cultural and also an aesthetic lens, not through the religious one as they were in the past. As part of a general interest in the cultivation of national consciousness and celebrating the achievements in industry and the arts and crafts, following the two main exhibitions I mentioned here, the Paris exhibition of 1878 and the Anglo-Jewish exhibition of 1887, the Jewish Museum in Vienna was opened in 1895 and followed by 1906, the Jewish Museum in Prague, and of course the Jewish Museum of St. Petersburg in 1916, and later in Budapest in 1932, just to mention a few. These museums really mark the next step in these kind of collecting and these kinds of displaying of these objects. So there's much more to say about that, but I really tried to condense it, and I hope you were able to grab just pieces of it. And thank you very, very much for your time.
My first question to all three of you, and it's about a theme, I suppose, that runs through all of your papers, is something about the idea of loss. And I suppose loss is such a big category, both in terms of the history of collecting, but also in terms of Jewish history. And I was going to start, so I have a variation on loss for each of you. For Colette, the question of loss, I suppose, is about how the album, as you say, is trying to kind of resist the process of dispersal that Ferdinand sort of suspects is coming. I wonder whether you could say a little bit about why he thinks loss is inevitable, or how he sees loss as part of bigger changes that are happening in the history of wealth or the sort of structure of English society at the end of the 19th century. And also sort of related to that, what does he think will be lost from the objects if they're sort of removed from being kept together? Because you had this interesting thing that you could take the objects out of the house as long as the objects remain with each other. So I just wonder if I could push you a little bit. What is it that is sort of contained in the collection that means that the objects need to be preserved as a kind of single unit? For Milena, thinking about loss, I would just be really interested to know more about how visible these Polish Jewish collectors were, in terms of to what extent have they been acknowledged within scholarship? To what extent are they part of standard accounts of Polish art history? And how visible was their contribution to Polish museums? Like, to what extent, you know, is that memory politics still ongoing, or is this a slightly sort of lost legacy? And for Shir, I just wondered if you could say a little bit about whether there's something sort of, I don't know, archaizing, is that the wrong word? I'm thinking of when Richard Cohen talks about sort of ghetto chic with this kind of thing. How do we make sense of this celebration of ancient Jewish communities, while at the same time suggesting that Jews are sort of productive, powerful contributors to modern society as well? Like, to what extent do you see these shows as kind of, you know, creating Jewish identity as somehow locked in the past? And again, if you could talk a little bit about the loss that hangs over these objects with secularization, I'd be interested. Thanks.
Should I start?
Yes.
Okay.
Brave. I was just rambling, so leap in.
Well, I went first. Well, I think from my understanding, at least what I've gathered from the few things he has written, is that I think he kind of, in general, perceives the act of collecting as a process of loss, because for every object you are gaining, that you have to assume that it's being lost from another person. And it's especially with the rise of like auction houses that kind of come to popularity in the 18th century, and the beginning of, you know, these inventories, catalogs that basically lay out a person's entire belongings, personal, intimate objects, just for open season to be collected and bought by whomever, just completely out of your control. So what my sense is of Waddesdon Manor, that he was probably a highly controlling person, just judging by the degree of specificity that he designed the house and so many other aspects of his life. So I think that, of course, for a controlling person, the idea that he wouldn't be able to control what happened to his precious belongings, you know, once he was gone, was probably a source of great anxiety. Yet, though he also didn't do anything about it in terms of trying to find himself another heir or wife. Though, I mean, I did exclude the fact that, you know, the reason I think his legacy was preserved so well is indeed because his sister took over the house, and she did so much to preserve his memory. But yeah, I think that, in a sense, being able to capture the house as it was under his guidance became a, you know, he used the album as a medium to do that, because, and also just a sense of photography as well, like on a philosophical level, is a lot about loss and capturing what is or isn't. So I don't know. Or metaphysical, but whatever.
Well, as for me, thank you, Thomas, for this very, very interesting and important question. So, to say it shortly, they are absent. Like, there is no commemorating of their contribution to Polish culture. There was, in 2015, there was an exhibition in the National Museum in Warsaw, which was entirely devoted to Bronisław Krystal. Only that the problem was that this exhibition was not somehow emphasizing his double identity. This was just an exhibition which was devoted to a collector, to a Polish collector, and I was contributing to this exhibition. I was writing a short essay where I was just stating this in one sentence, and that's all. So for the rest, okay, there's also information in the catalog that he was collecting Judaica, and everything is said, but there's no let's say there's no interpretation of this. There's let's say there's no idea how to see this whole phenomenon of Jewish art collecting in Warsaw. So something like this is unfortunately not existing. And for the rest, all other collectors, Goldberg-Górski, he was also commemorized with a short essay which was published in the 60s, and that's all. And there's also almost no word about his identity. So there was also, I think, not the right time for this. So this kind of process of admitting that there was a group of Poles who were of this double identity, and they were facing some lack of acceptance. Yes, this is still in front of us, unfortunately. So this is a long topic, and maybe for another discussion, and also about how the topic concerning how collecting studies in Poland are, and how conservative they are, and how still we are awaiting this new period, new chapter, where studies including Jewish collectors or women collecting this, it's still in front of us. So
sorry, I would like to say something, namely, you have forgotten about, let's say, Jewish Institute in Warsaw. And of course, I am not talking now about the Polin, the Jewish, the Museum of Polish Jews. When at the exhibitions, they also, let's say, the Jewish collectors are mentioned. In the Jewish Historical Institute, even earlier, one showed, let's say, from time to time, and especially the Bertin Museum, because it is, let's say, the museum of Jewish, of Polish, of the Jewish community in Warsaw. So this is, of course, when Milena is speaking, she's speaking about, let's say, the collectors and the Polish Jewish collectors, and that in the, let's say, museums which are not original Jewish museums, they do not remind, let's say, the Jewish collectors. But but one cannot forget it, that in Polin and in the Jewish Historical Museum, and also in Galicia Museum now in Krakow. So it goes a little bit in the good direction, I would say so.
Yes, but you're right, Nawojka. But I have a feeling like two parallel worlds. Like there's this milieu of those who are explicit dealing with Jewish history and Jewish topic, and there's the rest, like this, like you mentioned. Like I'm seeing this more from this perspective of a national museum in Warsaw, and this is a completely neglected topic. Yes,
of course, obviously.
Nawojka has actually said what I was going to say, which was about Matthias Bertin. So thank you for making that point. And
but Bertin, but also in Lemberg, in Lviv, you have to know this was very interesting situation, namely the museums and the secular collections were also present in Krakow, in Vilnius, in Lemberg. Maximilian Goldstein, this is, let's say, the name, or Giełżyński, whose collection afterwards started the collection in New York. And one cannot also forget about, let's say, Mintz, because this is also the part of the New York collection. And one cannot forget Stieglitz, Abraham and Joseph. So I only what I want to say, that in the case of these collections, let's say the Polish Jews were almost in the avant-garde of the Jewish collections, and this idea of the importance of the, especially of course, of Judaica in the sense of ceremonial objects, and also of Torah and incunable and so on.
That's brilliant. Shir, do you want to come in on that point? Because it speaks so clearly to this, and also the kind of ambiguity between museum spaces and communal synagogue spaces as places to see these sorts of works.
Yeah, and thank you, Nawojka. It's lovely to see you after ages.
See you, I said. Great.
To see you a little older. Well, I speak for myself, not for you.
I'm happy to see you.
Yeah, so I'll start with the question of loss that you asked, Thomas, and I'll try to connect the two if I can. So primarily, I think really the issue here is of a lot of communities trying to connect to the local societies, communities that existed as minority groups alongside, you know, whether it was in Great Britain, whether it was in France, whether it was as a result of migration processes taking place during 18th century or before. And I think it's a very strong example in the case of the British society and the Jewish minority group there, because they do have a very distinct history in the UK, and I think they were trying to bring that to light and to show that they do belong and to basically justify their role in society in a way of looking at it historically, by looking at these historical artifacts, and by also displaying perhaps themselves as a group through a secular point of view and not through that religious point of view that was the traditional way of looking, at least specifically at the Jews, as this small, odd, slightly different minority group with other traditions that were a bit obscure. So I think in that sense, these exhibitions were a part of displaying that and becoming a part of society. And also, as I mentioned, comparing in a way, or putting them in line with the Christian relics and equating them in that sense to what was already familiar in most of these societies, in most of these environments. So kind of taking their place and making themselves known. And Novoika, in terms of what you were saying, and again, this is part of a research that was specifically dedicated to the transition of Jewish collectors from Europe to the United States. So a lot of it was done around the Jewish Museum in New York and around Mintz, Ben-Ghiat, and other collectors. I would say I'm trying to connect the two concepts, and maybe I'm going to do it the wrong way. So Novoika, feel free to correct me or to bring me back, to push me back in line. But I think that at least in terms of the collectors like Mintz, who really left in 1939, and as a result of course, anti-Semitism and the Nazi regime, what was already taking place in Europe, here I was trying to show a very different aspect of it in a way, because a lot of my personal research evolves around the Second World War and the rise of Nazism. So Mintz, of course, was able to, in a way, take advantage of the World Fair of 1939 and to get his collection out of Europe and move to New York. And eventually, this is, of course, one of the most important collections that's part of the Jewish Museum in New York. And he's not the only one. And I think in that sense, these kinds of exhibitions, whether it was the universal exhibitions and the world fairs that were taking place, and the fact that they were giving and a space, and we can question that space and in what way they were looking at ethnography, because obviously they were creating a very problematic way of looking at other minority groups, which we are not discussing in this conference. But they were giving a stage to the Jewish minority in that sense. So I think in that way, it was a way of getting themselves known and of displaying themselves in a different and offering a different interpretation of Jews and secular Judaism and what it meant to be Jewish, and to allow people to study them in a way, both as ethnographic, in an ethnographic sense, but also in a cultural and traditional sense, and as people of the society. So thanks.
Could I say something? Do you remember, Shir, this exhibition of let's say Jewish art and ceremonial objects, especially in Lviv, 1894, just in this regional exhibition? This was also quite interesting. This is almost parallel in time. And this is the same attitude. This was interesting because it was in Lviv. So in this part of Poland, which belonged to Austria, where the situation of Jews in this moment or in this time was relatively, of course, easy compared, for example, with Russia, where this is, of course, a catastrophe. So this development in one way was parallel as, let's say, development which you described in Western, I mean, in France or in England.
And also in Budapest, the first exhibition, I think, was in 1896. Yeah.
Picking up, actually, Navoika, you're not off the hook just yet, because I'm going to use your question, your very good question in the chat, and slightly rework it in a way for all three of them. I would be interested to hear from all of you. Navoika has asked, when can one talk about collections being shaped by a Zionist perspective? I suppose opening that up more broadly, I'd say, how far do these collections show an awareness of an international Jewish world, that there is a people called the Jews who are not just the Jews of England or the Jews of France, but that you belong to a bigger kind of community. And I'm going to be cheeky and say, even Colette, if you want to think about how far the Rothschild collections participate in bits of the Waddesdon bequest in the story of Jewish communities in Europe, or equally Milena, I was struck with that Hirschenberg painting, that we're thinking about refugees from Russia and the Pale of Settlement in this Polish art. And so to what extent is there an idea here of a bigger Jewish world community?
Well, it's definitely present, as I was trying to show it with paintings like Hirschenberg's painting in Reicher's collection. And but still, I would, for example, say that those collections and those collectors were slightly different from for example, Berson, and for example, from those collectors who were collecting explicit Judaica and Lesser Gierdziński. I think this is kind of a different concept of creating their identity. So it is present, and I sometimes, while studying those collections, especially Reicher's, I think in Reicher's and Crystal's collection, this was most vivid. I have a feeling like they were struggling with this identity. So it's really like somehow visible, and you can see that those pieces, like for example in this catalog from Reicher, there were pictures of paintings who were in the collection, and there were no depictions of those pieces of collection which were somehow associated with this Jewishness. Yes, so they were in the collection, but they were not present in the catalog. So there is some sort of ambiguity, yes, with it.
But Milena, please do not forget that both, I mean, Gierdziński and Berson, they collected also different art and different objects, but simply this part, which was the, let's say, Judaica, they decided to give to the Jewish communities. So, for example, this was also the collection of very different things and interests, because they were also, let's say, interested as historians. So, if I'm asking about Zionist, this is one interesting name, which is of course well known for all of us, namely Mihal Zagaiski. This is very interesting case, because he really collected from one side, let's say, old masters, but really the great collection of Judaic, and he was engaged, really devoted Zionist. He did not have, let's say, Polish artists. He had in his villa, which was a very modern one, designed by avant-garde architect in Warsaw, but he did not have the Polish paintings. He had old fashioned furniture and a few old masters, but only Judaica. And this is very interesting, very, very engaged Zionist. And if you see, for example, of Priłucki or Goldflam, they collected only, let's say, Judaica, very consciously, because they really were interested, and they supported Zionism, or let's say, is in Evo. But in Evo, this was different movement. I mean, this was more Bundist and Yiddishism, but also they were collected in this in this direction.
If I may just add a few words about my three collectors, let's say. I think for these three collectors, there wasn't a strong sense of Zionism. I think there's a sense of Jewish community and Jewish tradition, and it derives from a very different aspect, not from a national aspect in the sense of a Zionist aspect, but in a national aspect in the sense of European nationalism, which is quite different, of course. So it's more a sense of belonging to their local society, to the local community. And of course, there's a lot of philanthropy that was going on that I didn't mention by these families, philanthropy of the Alliance Israelite Universal and other organizations that were developing in 18th century, in 19th century. And there was, of course, and part of it is also a result of the Jewish ideas, concept of charity and other, of course, Jewish traditional ideas. And in terms of collecting the objects themselves, the objects for these collections range from a variety of places across Eastern and mostly Western Europe, what we today call Western Europe, I suppose. Also some from Eastern Europe, and they're from a variety of communities, a variety of backgrounds. Not all of them are identified to, at least as far as my understanding goes. They're not, some of them from my experience have not been fully identified, let's say, in terms of being accurately identified according to the period, etc. They have been generally described, and oftentimes the location where they were purchased or where they were found or acquired, etc., is mentioned, but there isn't much information beyond that from the early catalogs, that appears in the early catalogs. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Colette, do you want to have a kind of a go at the tricky question about sort of the Rothschilds' awareness of international?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think for the Rothschilds, since they already had such a vast network within their own family, that often probably the need to seek a community outside of that was not necessary. However, I mean, it's documented that he went on a long journey across Europe with his two English cousins right after his wife died. And there's plenty of documentation of them going directly to the Jewish ghettos in order to source like materials that they're looking for, you know, silver plates in Venice, and they even talk about how they had celebrated Rosh Hashanah in Russia with like a non-Orthodox sect and how it was strange to them. And I also know that he spent time in South Africa dealing with diamonds with a Jewish connection there. So, I mean, certainly, and then as well as I know he interacted with many Jewish antique dealers that he writes about. So yeah, certainly there is some sort of Jewish network at play, but I don't.
And all I would add, and I completely agree, all I would add is there's also, is it the Pressburg Cup, that in the Waddesdo bequest itself, there is an object that was once owned by a Jewish community in Prague. So yeah, sort of inscribing that in a kind of national museum is itself a kind of an interesting identity move. I'm conscious that we are now about to run out of time, so I'm going to quickly, can I ask, there's a couple of other questions come in and they're individual questions. So quickly for Colette, and this is from Shir, thank you for this, Shir. Have you viewed similar albums by other European collectors? An interest in here and how far the album project contains the house and the collection. To what extent was it a way of creating an eternal memory before it was donated to the British Museum? So the question of other albums and also eternal memory. Yes, there are many other albums. I think it was actually a quite common object to create after you built and decorated a large house. Many examples from within his own family. And so they do, I mean, and I also think throughout this conference, we've seen probably a lot of photos that probably were sourced from these types of albums. They seem recognizable, the kind of, you get the same views for a lot of them. So yes, there are more similar, but this one, I find the Red Book is unique in that it is annotated by Ferdinand personally, which I haven't found in any others. Colette, thank you. For Milena, there is another question from Shir asking, can you tell us a little bit more about Crystal's Judaica collection? How did it fit with the fine art collection and where did he get it from?
Thank you, Shir. Well, how did it fit with the fine art collection is not clear. There's not many evidence how he purchased his art and his Judaica. So I think that if there's anything you can find about it, I would suggest to check this catalog from this exhibition, which took place in Warsaw, in the National Museum in Warsaw in 2015. So it's pretty fresh. Yes, it's not long a time ago, and I think it's still somehow available, this catalog. But for the rest, I think it was not somehow exposed part of his collection. And there are few photos, few pictures of his apartment where he's depicting the pieces of this, how he arranged the collection, and there is no piece of Judaica which is there to be found. It's only about those Polish art masterpieces. There's even like an icon of the Holy Mother, the Russian icon, yes, but unfortunately no Judaica.
I see Navoika has it on her shelf. I got a glimpse of a book with a pink cover.
Thank you. That's so kind, Navoika. My essay is in English, so yes, if you would like to read it, I recommend it, of course. I invite you.
Wonderful. There's also a comment here, which is not a question, but I will point out here, the exhibition by Marek Rostworowski on Polish Jews from 1989 as another important reference. The final question, though, is going to be for Shir, and it's from Isabel Muir. And I should say that Isabel is actually doing a PhD on Jewish donors to the National Gallery in London, where, although it's a very different political context, is another story about minorities within a majority culture. And her question is regarding loss. It struck me on hearing about the Strauss collection that its survival as a named collection is extraordinary, since it was bought by the Rothschilds. Indeed, it was exhibited under Nathaniel, not Charlotte's name, then moved from Cluny to the Maj, the Museum of Jewish Art. Shir, how can we account for its survival as the Strauss collection when so many other similar collections, like those of the Sassoons, lost their name and when they merged with a bigger kind of collection and ensemble? Why does Strauss stick?
Well, it's not only the Strauss, it's as Isabel. It's a beautiful question. Thank you, Isabel, and it's very to the point. But as you state, it's also due to the Rothschild name that it survived. Actually, the Rothschild name is the reason probably for its survival, because it was purchased for the nation. It was not purchased for the Rothschild family. It was actually planned to be immediately bequeathed for the French nation. So it became immediately a part of the Cluny Museum, and it was immediately integrated within that collection. And that probably has to do with its survival. I know we're running out of time, but in another time or offline, I'm happy to talk to you and to think more about the survival of other Judaica collections, especially throughout the Second World War. And of course, there's a lot that was written about this, and probably the best example is the Prague Jewish community, and of course the Danzig Jewish community that sent their collection to New York. So I hope that's helpful.